Voodoo Vince isn't exactly what you'd expect from Microsoft. Known more for mature games like Halo and Gears of War, the Xbox of old was much more open to experimentation. The era as a whole, PS2, GameCube, Dreamcast, and the original Xbox were a time of tossing things at the wall and seeing what stuck, and Microsoft had a lot of work ahead of them to find their niche and try to make something out of Xbox. Voodoo Vince was developed by Beep Games, a small studio that only released this game for consoles, then made a series of small, downloadable PC games until they died, and they had a brief revival in 2017 solely to make Voodoo Vince Remastered the subject of today's video, which was released on the Xbox One and PC. Voodoo Vince is a 3D platformer, pure and simple, although it does differ from its contemporaries in its focus. Most 3D platformers at the time were collectathons focused on exploring mid-sized areas for various collectibles, while the few outside of that tended to be extremely linear platformers, like Crash Bandicoot or a million junk license games. Voodoo Vince is neither, but also kind of both, a linear set of levels that Vince goes through, with small paths and branches that lead to collectibles but which aren't necessary for progression. Voodoo Dust gives Vince an extra unit of health for every 100 he collects, relics give extra voodoo powers, and Skull Notes spawn a skull that can be chased down to get an extra unit of voodoo magic, a great collectible that tests the player's knowledge of an area after they've already spent time learning the layout getting the notes, which is far more satisfying than collectibles just being out in the open like all the other ones. All these things are helpful for getting through the game, but not necessary for progression. Instead, levels have a variety of objectives, usually solving some environmental puzzle to open a path to the next area, but occasionally finding things or just getting through linear segments. Vince has a simple moveset, but the level design makes good use of it, although it is a little jank. Vince has the standard double jump, but with two quirks. They're very vertical, but don't carry momentum or have much horizontal distance. The game is designed for this, and his other moves help, but it does feel weird at first, as does the fact that he can only use the double jump at the peak of his first jump. Way too long and the window is gone. It feels really strange at first, but I did adjust eventually. It's not a bad thing, it just requires getting used to. It's a little different. The spin attack can stun enemies in combat, but more importantly acts to give Vince an amount of horizontal distance in the air. It's not to the extent that Crash Bandicoot's spin attack does or anything. In general, Vince is much stiffer and less fluid than other platformers of the era, which again is not awful, just pretty different. The spin attack can also be changed, supplemented, or replaced by the hover, a fairly unique aspect of the moveset which allows Vince to slow his descent but heavily slows his forward momentum. Later in the game, chaining it with spin attacks is necessary at points to clear large gaps. This moveset is almost the entirety of Vince's moveset. There's no major changes to his powers throughout the game, but the game squeezes a ton of use out of these simple actions. Only supplemented by two simple upgrades, one of which only lets Vince see collectibles through walls, which is never technically necessary, but certainly helpful. And the nail, which lets Vince swing from glowing orbs, something that only comes up a few times in the late game and is fairly simplistic. Combat is fairly weak, but it isn't meant to be engaged with that much. The spin attack can open enemies up, and then Vince can mash the attack button to get hits in. That's all there really is to it. The ground pound attack is nearly useless, and there is a minor issue in that some enemies do contact damage, so Vince's attacking hits can cause issues with him kind of just walking into them while he's punching them. But enemies are obstacles meant to be avoided. The only reward for killing them outside of a few required sections is replenishing health, which is only lost through combat, and charging voodoo power, the out to combat in most situations. When a voodoo power is used, Vince kills himself. He is a voodoo doll after all, which kills all enemies nearby. Killing 2 or 3 will usually replace the spent voodoo meter, and the animations are cute, with more added as relics are collected. The effects of the voodoo powers don't change with the different animations, but seeing how enemies get the same punishment as Vince is a nice reward in itself. In case it wasn't obvious from the things I've said, Vince can only be harmed by enemies or falling off of ledges. Self-harm through the environment is used for puzzles, and in combat to skip combat. The puzzles are a really fun creative bunch, for example Vince lighting himself on fire to move fire around a stage, which is also how bosses are fought. Not necessarily the fire thing, but finding a way to kill yourself. A great use of the character's design to advance gameplay. Beyond this, there's lots of alternate gameplay styles, as platformers love to have. They range from mediocre to bad, and usually land right about at frustrating, but none are large enough to go into detail until they're more relevant. I also want to briefly touch on difficulty. While I don't think the game is excessively difficult until the final chapter, the live system is very strange. Dying is simultaneously too harsh and not very harsh at all. Vince starts with 3 lives, though you can find more in the environment. Falling off a ledge costs 1 of these, as does running out of health, which comes with the odd punishment of draining the voodoo meter, which kinda nullifies the task of hunting down skulls to add to it and even gaining more health. Getting a game over is also bizarre. It boots you back to the menu, but outside of bosses, who are entirely reset, collectibles remain collected and interactable objects remain switched, meaning it just sends the player back through a few things they've already cleared. It's more of an annoyance than anything and feels very needless, like it could have just completely scrapped the lives and the game wouldn't be harmed in any way. You could just make it so the bosses... I don't have a good solution for the bosses because they get tough. The game is very charming in its other aspects too, from visuals to audio to writing, which is kind of a rarity in video games. Vince is a very strong design himself, with a strong silhouette, the awkward head shape, the pins. He stands out really well, while the rest of the cast is also pretty strong. Enemies are a little plain, but humans look like 3D versions of Billy and Mandy characters, which is very fitting for the tone the game goes for, and really appeals to me as someone who grew up in that era of cartoons. Enemies are a bit generic, save the bosses, but have a full set of animations to go with Vince's voodoo powers, which is an impressive effort even for the limited enemy roster. I mean, there's like 50-ish voodoo powers, so every enemy has... a couple are reused here and there, so every enemy probably has like 20 or 30 death animations just based on the voodoo powers alone. The stages also have a lot of variety despite all being set in the similarity of the Cajun area. There's a haunted manor, the Bayou itself, a circus. Even in these zones, the different areas have nice variety too, which leads into the music. A soundtrack like you don't hear in games, hell, like you don't really hear in movies. Smooth jazz, mellow bluegrass. While it often feels a little too mellow for the game, it's undeniably very fucking different, and it helps set the tone well for each area. The writing is also worth noting, not so much for the fairly basic story, but for the characters, especially from Vince, who exudes that N64 era rareware sarcasm in a really fun way.
This is the train?
Isn't it wonderful?
I don't know if you've noticed, but this is a toy. The only place it's going is nowhere!
Never really laugh out loud funny, but he's such an ass that it makes him charming. He's constantly annoyed with the lunatics around him, wanting to get his shit done so he can go home, and he'll be a complete dick and let them know. It's a lot of fun and helps carry the story-based segments. I mean, Vince dryly quipping while he runs over a living being very slowly with a steamroller, it's fun, you know, it makes the cutscenes entertaining rather than snooze fests that just exist to, like, bridge together the areas.
I rule! I'm sorry? Speak up, I can't hear you.
To begin the game, Madame Charmaine, Vince's creator, is kidnapped by Cosmo, a carny who wants to use her voodoo dust to rule the world. He frequently appears as a ghostly apparition to taunt Vince, and he's kind of fun as the clown he is, constantly being pretty dumb and impotent. Not threatening, but that's pretty okay for the tone they're going for. Each world has a few sub-areas, each of which has its own objectives. The first area, the quarter, begins with the basic tutorial areas, the first backstreet being the control and combat stuff, while the docks introduces the environmental puzzles. Wake up the pig, lure it onto the button, and stand on the Vince-shaped outline to get squished and kill it. The puzzle itself doesn't matter, it's definitely not difficult, but it's there to show that Vince dying in certain ways is a good thing in a very small, controlled environment. Main Street takes this concept and puts it in a more practical application. This area is much more open, with side areas and collectibles as well, but the only goal is to remove the two talking gas pumps at the far end. To this end, Vince needs to light himself on fire and carry that flame to open gas lines along the way, creating new flames as checkpoints for an easy, safe platforming challenge, until the flame can be carried to the end and Vince can commit cold-blooded murder. The square shows off another puzzle type that doesn't come up as frequently, but it's kinda interesting in that it comes out similar to an old adventure game. Various items are available in the area, a mask, a trumpet, and money, and Vince needs to use these, as well as the clock tower, from which he can advance time, or turn it back, to open various stores in the area, and teach himself to play the trumpet to gain entry to the museum. Changing the clock can be a bit tedious, but the puzzle isn't overly complex or cryptic. There's a few red herring shops, like wasting money on strippers, which is kinda worth it for the humor, but the end goal is told to you pretty directly, and there's a logical through line that makes it a matter of execution over being stumped wandering around, which is nice even if the platforming is kinda light in this segment. The boss of the area, the Bone Goliath, sets the template for bosses in this game, and they're better than most platforms tend to have. As opposed to something like Mario, where bosses are jokes, or Crash Bandicoot, where bosses attack around and then are vulnerable for a hit, bosses in Voodoo Vince are mostly large set-piece platforming segments. The Bone Goliath swings its tail at Vince in the lower section, threatening to knock him off, while taking bites out of the other section. Meanwhile, Vince needs to flip a series of levers while avoiding attacks to electrocute himself and destroy the monster. It's a much more natural way to handle boss fights than running laps around Bowser and awkwardly tossing him, testing the same skills that the game normally does in a more intense environment, and it's a style that I really enjoy for this game and wish platformers would use more frequently. It's a really strong way to just reinforce everything that's been learned in the game. Some of the bosses don't do this as well, but most of them in this game are pretty okay. Roachfort, the obligatory sewer area, goes for a slightly different layout. The initial area, the central arena, serves as a hub where Professor Ethel is attempting to build a balloon to leave. The area itself just serves to connect two other areas. The order they're done in doesn't matter. To the right is the upper city, a fairly straightforward platforming section, more notable for a pretty difficult skull than actually navigating it, which connects to a further area, the basket case, the first of the alternate gameplay styles. Thankfully none of them feature collectibles, they're just straight shots, but most of them are not very good. Case in point, you go down ropes fairly slowly, use LNR to switch tracks, collect enough shirts to make a balloon part. It's not challenging or interesting and doesn't have enough depth to feel like it's a good distraction. Bad variety for the sake of variety is kind of a waste. From the hub, the left leads to the main tunnel, which is effectively a second hub, leading to another two areas which need to be opened by baiting enemies into exploding the walls in front of them away. One leads to the propeller room, a fairly straightforward platforming bit that has at least one great section, jumping across junk floating in water. It's reasonably more complex and challenging than anything else so far, especially as the objects eventually sink, effectively putting every jump on a timer. The other entrance has the rocket lab, which has an interesting gimmick. Don't know about good, but it's something. Slowly carrying a canister of explosive fuel to the end. The lowest level is a maze of platforms. Falling from any height causes it to explode, so it's a bit of test of pathfinding, while the upper areas are relatively easy by comparison, just timing slow walks between bursts of flame. This section goes on for way too long, especially if you keep making minor mistakes because everything is pitch black and you can't see where you're going. A little frustrating. Unfortunately, this task also leads to another alternate game mode, Throttle Up, a mediocre plane flying thing. The murky colors don't help, but it is pretty standard. The plane moves forward on its own, you swerve through obstacles. It goes on way too long, it's not very interesting, and somehow this is the thing that returns for another segment later. With all the pieces collected, Ethel tosses Vince out of the balloon, which leads to another boss fight against the two-headed lizard. This one is fairly weak. It wanders around shooting beams that never seem to come anywhere close to hitting you. You jump off the trampoline on its back that's there for some reason. Jump into the spikes repeats. Jumping into the spikes itself is kind of fun, but there's really no progression in the battle. The lasers don't seem to get more difficult, or the boss doesn't seem to do anything different. It's kind of repetitive after the first jump. Crypt City returns to a linear structure, but focuses a bit more on exploring wide areas. After the first bit, Gatekeeper Jam anyway, which is just a shitty Simon Says game that leads into a more straightforward area. Immediately after is Sarcophagus Shuffle, which is likewise very linear, where Vince needs to get a spring for a cannon. The spring controls are a bit weird. Vince can only move forward from the ground, there's no air control, but it's a pretty short segment, so the fact that it's weird and kinda bad is tolerable. Actually launching Vince out of the cannon is poorly thought out. Vince is shot out in an arc, which is all fine and good, but the arc is very dramatic and there's no indicator for aiming, which leads to basically aiming vaguely into space and praying, either having to run back to the cannon over and over or dying instantly and wasting lives. And this is not the only time that you have to shoot yourself out of cannons. Seems every time that the game deviates from platforming, things get questionable pretty fast, but the platforming is usually good. Zombie Guidance Counselor is just a brief defend the thing where voodoo powers make it free. You just fight off a bunch of goblins for a while. And that leads into downtown Crypt City, which is probably the most open area of the game. Likely because the All-Seeing Eye is found here, which lets the devs get a bit more creative hiding collectibles as they can now be seen through walls. The area itself isn't threatening beyond some difficult collectible placements, just using fireflies to turn on some lights and open up the clock tower. The third boss is the only one that isn't a platformer, which is probably why it's terrible. Rat Race Rodeo has Vince circle an evil statue on a moderately controllable rat, dodging shockwaves while avoiding gaps in the floor and praying a rock lands on him. The mouse control's weird, the rocks fall too quickly unless you happen to be directly under a shadow, in which case they never seem to fall, and the drop shadows have bad visibility on the brown and gray floor, which leads to lengthy laps around the statue just hoping things line up until you game over and go back to the start, slowly running laps until the rocks finally fall again. It's the worst parts of all the alternate gameplay styles combined, tedious, awkward, and completely uninteresting. Brusque Manor is the Haunted Mansion level, but it's at least a bit more distinct than the usual evil ghosts and spooky spirits. The Porch Pooch is a 30-second level where you grab the thing to enter, the rest is a lot more interesting. The central hub, the Tumbler Room, which connects to the other areas, has rotating walls activated by buttons, one for each floor. Only the first one is interesting, with a small puzzle attached, while the other two are kinda just obligatory, but it's something a little different, even if it's moderately tedious. The busy butler area has a ghost butler create a small segment of standable path through a gigantic pit. He moves pretty fast, so keeping up feels good, and I like that he's more of an incidental ghost than some kind of enemy. It also leads to meeting Dolly, one of the more interesting characters in the game, the psychotic doll who runs what's left of the manor. She's pretty fun, constantly seeming like she's about to explode, which, when contrasted with Vince being tired of her shit, is a lot of fun. She wants Vince to kill some monsters on the second floor. In Unwanted Guests, Vince needs to do some challenging and fast platforming to light himself on fire and blow up monster eggs, which is good stuff. While its follow-up, the trophy room, is less good. The idea is the same, use crossbows to launch Vince through candles. Like the cannon, it shoots in an arc and feels just as bad as the cannon, but you also need to do it 3 times while avoiding enemies. After some back and forth, Dolly offers to take Vince to the Carnival via train, but first he has to pass through Glowberry Tangle, where the grappling nail is introduced. Its usage is pretty simple, with no interesting twists, but the area stands out. Despite being branches over Black Void, it's fairly colorful by the standards of the game, and outside of the grappling stuff offers some pure strong platforming. When Vince shows up at the train, he finds that it's a model playset. He's understandably pissed and the Dolly fight plays out. It's a really creative and fun one, primarily for its setting of a little tiny city and surrounding areas around the train tracks. There are 3 switches in the area that start the trains to crash in different areas. Vince needs to get crushed at all 3, which provides 3 separate platforming challenges, racing the trains through separate routes for a little variety each time. It's a cakewalk for sure, Dolly's attacks never even seem to come close to hitting, but the setup and setting are both very creative, as is the little platforming puzzle attached. Crawdad Jimmy's serves as the hub for the Bayou. The area itself is nothing special, but navigating to the other areas with the boat is kinda fun. It's pretty fast and controls well enough that out of all the alternate gameplay styles, it's probably the strongest. John Lafayette's ship is an extremely simple and short platforming segment on a cool setting of a shipwreck, while the interior below decks, it's just spinning living onions into a cage. Both areas are good, but neither is incredibly strong. You have to keep in mind if you ignore collectibles or skim them as I have been. Most of these levels are only a few minutes each with a few exceptions. Earth, Water, and Wood, located in a different area of the pond, is technically simple platforming, but the more naturalistic layout of the stage is an interesting twist. Crossing the trees feels like you're not supposed to be doing it, but the complexity continues to rise in nice ways throughout, and it has a little test of speed to get the boat back to the center of the map. The gate-lowering cutscenes interrupting the gameplay rubs me wrong, but I don't mind the boat nearly as much as the plane or the basket thing. In the center is the Sausage Works, mostly just a reward level. It's impossible to fail unless you fall in the one singular pit at the bottom. You just shove the animals onto the conveyor belts after you point them to the sausage maker and watch them Rube Goldberg up to their deaths. It's basically just a little bit of fun after the relatively stressful stage leading here. The Fog Wallow also has tolerable alternate gameplay style with the submarine. It controls well, it's just used to press some switches and bait the lobster into the cage. It's accompanied by nice vertical platforming. This area is largely the strongest in platforming as the focus switches a bit in the next area. Let's see, there's a boat race, fine enough. There's a boss, which is not great. Hurricane Handout basically just passively blows debris at Vince, run between the switches, hit, repeat. It's virtually mindless and not much of a platforming challenge given that the heavy winds push you back if you jump, so you're kind of just running between switches and then making 2 jumps at the end to pull the 4th switch. Yeah, this all leads into the final area, so. The Carnival is the ultimate test of everything the players learned, sometimes taking it a bit too far. The midway area is good, the goal is to get 5 coins from doing little tasks in the area, fighting enemies, small platforming challenges. The literal RNG one is a bit tedious, but for the most part it's a fine little segment before the game gets really mean. Finger's Land of Ride serves as a hub to connect 2 further areas. The House of Awfully Scary Things is a terrible light gun shooter. Long, tedious, and with a gun that overheats too quickly for you to realistically pass this janky minigame without taking a little bit of damage. While the House of Mirrors is disparate platforms that jolt back and forth in a giant maze. Navigating it sucks, landing on platforms can be frustrating because they literally yank themselves out from under you, and the autism puzzle piece theming is kinda distracting. The boss fight against Evil Vince isn't too bad, but you kinda just nuke his mobs, then hit him 3 times. The mobs heal you so much that if you've been collecting zombie dust, you basically can't lose no matter how many of Evil Vince's attacks hit you. Completing these sub-areas turns the rides back on in the hub. The platforming is interesting but stressful. The rides that you have to jump across to reach the final area move very quickly. Actually landing on them can be pretty tough, and sometimes the path forward is a bit unclear. And one mistake means crossing the entire stage and starting from square one, which is probably worse than death as far as a punishment goes. It's creative and challenging, but almost a bit too much compared to what came before. I like the feeling of stress it brings, but I also wish there was some kind of safe point midway. The final boss of the game is the ultimate platforming challenge, and I do like that. It feels good. What doesn't is that both forms of the final boss are extremely long and have some absolute bullshit lodged in. Bumper Car Bump Off, the first stage of the fight against Cosmobots, which is exactly what it sounds like, makes the unfortunate decision to be dreadfully long and mix in messy alternate gameplay styles. Losing anywhere in this mess causes you to start from the bottom, and 10 straight minutes of this shit gets pretty frustrating near the end. The actual bumper car stuff is the worst part of the level. Cosmobot on the second and third rounds of smashing the target seems to actively and quickly target you and get in your way when he doesn't, and the bumper car moves just slow enough that getting away from him feels basically impossible if you get bad luck. The middle section is some pretty intense platforming mixed with fairly mindless grapple hook segments. I actually don't mind this part of it at all. Some of the platforming is a little spooky, but I don't think I ever legitimately died on any of the platforming things, unlike the bumper cars in the ending plane section. Although once you realize how slow the missiles that Cosmobot shoots are in that segment, you can kinda just fly to the edge of the stage, shoot him until he blasts missiles, then veer out of the way. So it's not so bad, but I'd really prefer if there was just not the bumper car segment or the plane segment. I just prefer if things are kept simple, I think. Which is exactly what the final stage does. Inside Cosmobot is basically perfect as far as the final challenge goes. Tough and varied platforming, centered on getting past moving obstacles, like these weird gears that raise when you stand on the other, and these moving gears which are a little bit too stressful, but manageable with patience. Even the normally pretty passive grappling sections have obstacles to keep the pace up. I could do without the rising death barrier, but it resets its position if it does catch you eventually, so if you have lives to spare, it's pretty manageable to reset it when you hit like a certain point. Inside Cosmobot is also thankfully its own level, so you can't be sent back that far. This section's a lot shorter than the first one. After harming himself enough to destroy Cosmobot's brain, Vince frees Charmaine with a sequel tease that sadly never happened. Cosmo and his goons are turned to balloons, and Vince pops them to send them flying. The end. Voodoo Vince is a relic of a dead era of Microsoft and the Xbox brand. The remaster is a great way to play the game. It's mostly unchanged as far as I can tell. Visuals are sharper, resolution is obviously up, but it's the same game, jank and all intact. It would have been nice to see a bit more of Vince, but I imagine it just wasn't in the cards. The success of Halo fundamentally pushed Xbox to continue on being the mature console, a dragon they've stuck with and even Sony has changed to chasing, which meant Vince is just a relic of an experimental era of video games as a whole. The game is generally really good when it's being a platformer. The platforming mechanics, like everything, are janky and weird in a way, but really satisfying when paired with the really unique level designs and concepts. There's mostly good bosses that actually test the platforming, and a decent amount of challenge in the end couple levels. A bit frustrating at times, but it is satisfying to conquer. A lot of the alternate game modes in it are bad. They're meant to break up the pace a bit, and they do, but probably not in the way that was intended. The music is really unique. I love the dark, jazzy styles, and the writing is fun. Vince is an enjoyable enough character to carry the relatively boring story forward in that grim, irritated way he does. It's a shame that the game has basically been buried by Microsoft because it's a nice, short, unique, fun game that deserves a little more love.
He goes crunch against the wall, and if you should slip, you're gonna take a voodoo fall. He's a hero who's just 10 inches tall. Vince the Voodoo Doll.